Thanks, everybody. It's great to be with you here this morning. One of the things I like to do before I go do a talk, and I do a lot of talks around the country, is I look at the agenda for the workshop, and I get a sense of what you guys are doing and what the issues are that you're covering. So I was looking at it the last couple of days, and I didn't understand 3/4 of what was on the agenda. It made lots of acronyms, but I showed it to my wife last night, and she said, and she has a more analytical brain than I do, and she said, oh, well, they want you to come and really give the human element to all the work they're doing in the IT area, and the healthcare, and the Medicaid management, and the infrastructure that they're building. So that's what I'm going to try and do, is make sure that you hear some really, I think, powerful stories about the people that you're all working to serve and support. So I think that's why you invited me, and I'm really happy to be here to do that. So I'm going to start this morning by actually asking you guys to do a little bit of a time travel experiment with me. So bear with me. I know it's early, and this may risk having you guys fall asleep, but close your eyes for a minute. Everybody close your eyes. And I want you to put yourself back into a classroom from your childhood. All right, somewhere between kindergarten and high school. Think of a class that you can remember and that you can visualize, and look around that room in that classroom, and particularly pay attention to the students in the room and what they look like, what they're doing, how they're interacting, what they're talking about. All right? Okay, open your eyes. So how many of you in that classroom saw students with and without disabilities interacting, working together, collaborating, studying for tests? Anybody? 1, 2. All right, about 2 people. How many of you were in that school that you were in, had a friendship in which there was a person with a disability and without a disability, and you were in that friendship? Kind of a mix. All right, a few more, that's not bad, 10, 15. How many of you were in a relationship, maybe we'll stick with high school just to kind of play it safe here, in which there was a person with a disability and without a disability in a romantic relationship? All right, a couple. So that's a good illustration of being kind of the way I grew up. When I was young, when I was 4 years old and I was in preschool, I went to the preschool. I grew up in New Jersey and moved to New Hampshire, like some other people in the room. And in my preschool, it was a great preschool. I was 4 years old. I remember pretty well. And I remember this kid named Richard that I became friends with. And Richard was a great kid. He used to do things like carry rocks across the playground, because that's what boys do for no particular reason, right? But there was something different about Richard that I remember, and I'm 53 now, so this is 49 years ago, and I remember it really clearly, that Richard had a difference. Anybody notice a difference in Richard? Just gesture if you see something different about Richard. Go ahead. Right, he had a headband on. And so I don't know if you can see in the back of the room, he's got this headband wrapped around his ears, and I remember thinking, like, what's wrong with Richard? Why does Richard have this headband? Richard became the kid with the headband. But he was a great kid. And I remember asking my mom one day, why does Richard have to wear this headband all the time? And she said, well, Richard's had a lot of ear problems and surgeries, and he needs that to cover, his ears, probably to protect from all the dust you guys are creating, carrying those rocks across the playground. And so that satisfied my curiosity, but the fact that I remember 49 years later that Richard was the kid with the headband is startling to me. So jump ahead a few years. I went to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to college. And at the time, how many of you remember the anti-apartheid movement back? It was really big, divestment from South Africa. People around my age probably remember that. So that was a big civil rights movement at the time, trying to divest from South Africa. There were a lot of discussions on my campus. Michigan, Ann Arbor is a very politically active campus around racial issues, not so much, a little bit of gender issues, but I remember really like anti-racism movements. I never remember anybody talking about disability rights. I never learned anything about disability history. In high school and college, I never saw that as a civil rights movement. I had no idea about it. So jumping ahead a few more years, my wife and I had our first son, Isaiah, in 1996. He just turned 22 over the weekend. And we're pregnant with our second son. She was pregnant. I had a little to do with it, but she did most of the work. And so we had actually a second child. We didn't know at the point if it was going to be a boy or a girl. But I started thinking about all the ways our family was going to grow together. And I have an older sister and a younger brother, and we were very active as kids. I played a lot of sports with my brother. We did hiking. We traveled all around the country to all the national parks. And Betsy and I always just had this vision for this very full life that our family would enjoy. And it was a wonderful thought to think that our family was expanding. So when our son was born, Samuel, we had that wonderful, blissful moment and actually months of excitement around our expanding family. And particularly because it was a boy, I was kind of relieved because I didn't know how I was going to parent a girl, but I also thought, all right, we know how to do boys. I have one boy, here's a second boy, we can do this. And I also started envisioning the relationship that my brother and I had, which was very close and continues to be close, that our boys would have. So that was great until about 3 or 4 months, and things weren't happening the way they were supposed to. Samuel was not trying to roll over. He wasn't trying to crawl. 4 months, 5 months. He wasn't trying to sit up. He wasn't babbling the way Isaiah did. And Isaiah was the kid who took his first step and said his first word at 10 months old. And he was always ahead of the curve. And so what do you think we did at that point? A little bit of concern at 4 or 5 months. What would you do? Call your pediatrician. And our pediatrician, who's great, Dr. Carney, still Samuel's pediatrician, said, well, you know, kids develop in all different ways, all different paces. Let's not panic, but let's bring in early intervention services. Do you guys know early intervention, federally funded service? Probably you've worked with them. And I remember like it was yesterday, these 5 smiling women sitting in our living room asking us question after question after question. And they were great, they were professional, but I just felt like everything they were asking was reinforcing our fears. You know, is he rolling over? No. This is 5, 6 months into his life. Is he trying to sit up? No. Is he babbling? Not really. And I remember they said at one point something like, if you hold him up under his arms, do his arms shrug up or do they hold firm? I said, they hold firm. They're like, good. Like, I got one right on this test that I really don't want to be taking. Anyway, they left, and it just reinforced all the fears we were having. So they said, listen, you know, just to be sure, why don't we have you call a neurologist, and we'll, you know, just have some tests done. And I just remember my stomach started feeling kind of nauseous and just this overwhelming sense that they were leading us down a path that I really did not want to be going down. Anyway, we saw the neurologist at about 8 months, and he started taking samples of Samuel, skin samples, blood samples, urine samples, and sending them all over the world to labs that specialize in the metabolic process of how food is turned into energy, and to try and do some analysis. And then we were in this moment of waiting for results. I don't know if some of you, I'm sure, have experienced this either for yourself or family members, just waiting for that call, hopefully telling you everything's fine, here's this wonderful pill that we have that's going to fix everything, and your son will be fine. But that call didn't come. The call that came at about 9 months old was, Mr. Habib, this is Dr. So-and-so. It looks like we have found a mitochondrial disorder in your son's, you know, pathology, and why don't you come in a couple weeks and we'll discuss that. So I had no idea what a mitochondrial disorder was. It had been a long time since high school biology. How many of you off the top of your head would say, oh yeah, mitochondrial disorder, sure. Well, anyway, what do you think I did at that moment? Right, went online and Googled mitochondrial disorder. And I remember sitting at my computer in my living room, this is what, 17 years ago or so, and the first thing that popped up in all those search words that start populating your screen was usually fatal. And I felt like I had been kicked in the stomach by a horse. And I remember very powerfully that feeling of seeing those words and just feeling like it was the worst moment of my life. So thankfully, I now know there are thousands of kinds of mitochondrial disorders. They have so many different implications. But in Samuel's case, they did cause cerebral palsy. And if you look at this cute picture now, does anybody notice something that was an early sign that we had no idea at the time? Just give me a gesture, right? You're right on it. You keep giving me all the answers. That's good. So the fists, the balled up fists, were early signs of very high tone from cerebral palsy that we just weren't noticing. So we went from this blissful moment that, you know, that kind of ended at about 4 or 5 months to now feeling like we had absolutely no idea what our son's future was going to be like. You know, just living in uncertainty. And then we started getting plunged into MRIs and CAT scans and blood work and all these tests. And then we have to figure out therapies and occupational therapy and physical therapy and speech therapy. Suddenly our whole world just exploded with, you know, managing the kind of things that you guys help people manage. You know, insurance and healthcare and all the appointments and all the specialists and uncertainty. And that was the feeling more than anything we felt, was just this sense of uncertainty. And fear. You know, fear, like what is Samuel's future going to be like? How can he have friends? How can he go to college? How can he go to school? And we decided we did not want to live in this place of uncertainty. And Betsy particularly said, you know, we have to find a different vision for Samuel than just panic and fear. So she ended up finding this incredible program. It's a national model called Partners in Policymaking. And no matter what state you're in, you probably have one of these in your state, Partners in Policymaking. In New Hampshire, it's called the New Hampshire Leadership Series. It's actually run out of the place where I work now at the Institute on Disability at UNH. And I call it, it's like a year-long boot camp for disability advocacy. and learning how to navigate the healthcare system, the educational system, the legal system, all these systems that we are not born to know how to navigate as parents. And many parents aren't forced to figure out how to navigate these very complex systems unless you have a family member with a chronic health condition or disability. So thankfully, that gave Betsy a whole different vision. And then I did that series, and it gave me a whole different vision. But those visions were the same thing. And the vision was, we want Samuel to feel like he belongs. We want him to feel like he belongs. And we meant belonging in our family, in our extended family, in our community, in our city of Concord, New Hampshire, and most certainly in his own neighborhood school. Because we were thinking, how could he possibly feel like he belongs in his community if he doesn't feel like he belongs in his own school? So the good thing is that Samuel never has self-doubt. He's the most positive and resilient person I've ever met in my life. He's always thinking ahead. He's always dreaming forward. He was leading us at this point in many ways. So when he got to preschool, he felt like he belonged. He just looked at that girl next to him, flash those eyelashes. No doubt that he belonged in preschool, and he was charming to everybody that he met. As he got older, he went to elementary school, and he was supported, sometimes quite literally, by his friends for this group photo, and he felt completely supported in his school. And thankfully, we had a brilliant teacher in his local public elementary school who is a K-1-2, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, multi-age teacher. And she loved the multi-age classroom model where you had kids of all ages together, mentoring each other, teaching each other, learning from each other at different levels. And Barbara O'Brien was just an incredible teacher and created this welcoming community in his classroom. The school extended, the experiences of school extended beyond school. So have you been involved in the Scouts, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, anybody? So you know about the Pinewood Derby? The little cars that they carve out of wood. That's the only reason Samuel got involved in the Scouts. He just wanted to race the Pinewood Derby car. And I remember no greater pressure in my life than working with Samuel to make sure his Pinewood Derby car was fast enough to not finish last. I was so nervous that first race, but he finished first. Very big moment for me as a dad. But the thing about Scouts were that he would roll in his wheelchair, and he would use his communication device mounted to his chair, a computer with a touch screen that has voice output to speak. None of the kids blinked an eye because they had been with him all day in school. And they knew that's just the way Samuel rolled. That's the way he communicated. He just did things a little differently. So he felt like he belonged in things like the Scouts. He wanted to do theater, so he did theater. And when he said his lines in Guys and Dolls, he was able to say them with his device. There was a little microphone mounted. Nobody blinked an eye. That was just the way Samuel participated. He loves sports. To this day, a huge sports fan, and we watch a lot of sports. We go to a lot of sports together, and he liked to play sports growing up. So he played baseball for quite a while. And so at first it was t-ball. And if you guys done t-ball, anybody? It's like herding cats pretty much, right? It's like kids just running across the field, backwards around the field. So a kid in a wheelchair, that's nothing. Like that's not anything to be afraid of because they just don't want kids colliding at second base and killing each other. Anyway, so t-ball was fine, but then as he got older, it was competitive baseball. And so you were out, you were safe, it got pretty serious. And Samuel's a very competitive kid, and his brother Isaiah, also a good baseball player, was a very competitive kid. So one day Samuel recruited Isaiah and Isaiah's friend Nick, both very good athletes, to push him up the first baseline in his wheelchair fast, because he wanted to be safe. So most kids at that level were actually hitting off the pitch ball, but Samuel hit off a tee, but again, nobody blinked an eye, because that's just Samuel did things a little differently. They just knew that. But he was going to be out or he was going to be safe. So he gets up there, and he hits a nice little dribbler up the third base line, which was great, because how many kids can actually throw from third base to first base at that age? Almost none of them. So Nick and Isaiah were ready to go. They were on either side of the wheelchair. They start pushing so hard, but they forgot to turn the brakes off of the chair. So those little levers. So Samuel almost does a face plant. He's laughing once he settles back down. The boys are frustrated because he's out by a mile. They're not even close. So the next time up, they're like, we're not going to make this mistake again. We're going to get Samuel up the first baseline. So he gets up there, hits a nice little dribble down the third baseline. They start pushing. The brakes are off. And they went so fast, it was like a Roadrunner cartoon with just dust and legs and everything flying all over the place. And it looked like they were going to be safe because they were going 100 miles an hour. But the kid playing first was not at all interested in baseball, and he was like looking up at the sky at airplanes, picking grass out of the ground, not knowing that this locomotive was about to run him over of two boys, a wheelchair, and two kids on either side going 100 miles an hour. Thankfully, my neighbor Dave was coaching first base, literally picks the kid up, pulls him out of the way, kind of like a red flag and a bull coming through. And the boys were safe, everybody was happy and alive, it was good. And then as Samuel got older, he continued to play baseball, and his coach, Doug, would push him in his chair. Sometimes he was out, sometimes he was safe, sometimes he got the game ball, but he felt like he belonged on that baseball field. So this is a pretty recent picture of Samuel and Isaiah from a wedding we went to. And Samuel's now a post-grad, which I'll talk more about in a minute, in high school, and Isaiah is a 22-year-old college senior out in Arizona. And I'm really proud of Samuel. Samuel's done some really wonderful things. He's been leading his own Iep meetings. I don't know if you're all familiar with the individualized education plan, but you have these meetings when you have an Iep, and you bring together regular education teachers, related service providers, therapists, paraprofessionals, your family, and in this case, our service dog, Samuel, Proton, who's under the table, Samuel's service dog. And Samuel actually works on his PowerPoint for these meetings with his special ed coordinator beforehand. He goes through the meeting with a PowerPoint. He's got a little button on his right that he goes through. And so he's learning to lead a meeting, which is a really important skill, right, in life, meeting leading. And he's got empowerment over the process. He's also done a lot of multimedia storytelling. He's actually the sports host of the community TV show that runs in the high school and that broadcasts to the school. So he's learning skills around multimedia production, filmmaking. He has become kind of a fashionista. He went to the prom in June, and he picked out this great fuchsia jacket and then texted it to his date, Anita, and she found a dress that kind of matched, close enough. I'm colorblind, so it doesn't really matter to me, but they said it matched. Anyway, they had a great time at the prom, and then just a couple days later, he graduated from high school, from Concord High School. That's his brother Isaiah and his good friend Jacob on the right. So that's pretty amazing considering that Samuel is a kid that has seizures, can't speak very fluently, can't read because his eyes jump around so much because of his cerebral palsy. He's needed all of his information auditorily delivered to him. He's got a feeding tube. He still has this mitochondrial disorder, which really depletes his energy. He's got a lot of challenges, but he graduated. He went right through high school and got a regular diploma. He's now in this point where it was never a question of can I go to college or might I go to college, but where should I go to college? Or when I go to college, where should I go? And I'm happy to report that he's now at the local community college in New Hampshire in Concord and doing extremely well in his classes. Just got his first grades, A's and B's. And that's been his presumption for a long time. I should go to college. But here's the thing. Samuel is actually representative of what we know about inclusive education. And there's been decades, 30 years of research around inclusion. And the research is quite definitive. And that is that kids with disabilities who have the opportunity to be in regular schools end up with better communication skills, higher academic achievement, wider social networks, fewer behavior problems, more opportunities for higher education, and more meaningful employment as adults. Now, I know that there are some kids that no matter what effort and what support you give will not necessarily survive in a local public school. I understand that, and there needs to be alternatives for those kids. But the problem is in this country, the starting point for most kids like Samuel, the starting point for most kids with disabilities is not necessarily the public school. It's almost like they start in a segregated setting and somehow have to earn their way into a regular setting, even though we know the research suggests that they will have better outcomes statistically if they have a regular education alongside their peers and access to the general education curriculum. And a lot of my work focuses on how can we support kids, how can we do everything we can to help a student be successful in a regular education school alongside their peers in their community and make them feel like they belong. How do we do that? What are the systems? What are the structures? What are the educational approaches? And I'll talk more about that. So in 2008, 10 years ago, I did a film called Including Samuel, and that was my first film that I made. I was a photojournalist for 20 years and then I just felt like I needed to do a film about Samuel's life and our journey for inclusion. So he was only 4 to 7 years old when I made this film, but it's actually gotten translated into 17 languages, and it's used all over the world as a catalyst for inclusive education. It's about Samuel, but it's also about 4 other individuals, one of whom has schizophrenia, who talks about her challenges in high school and beyond around trying to be successful. And she actually was in an out-of-district placement for a while, came back into high school. I'm still in touch with Emily. She still wrestles with her schizophrenia very profoundly, but she's just trying to get the support she can. One was on a young boy with autism. Another was on an adult with cerebral palsy. And it's each of these stories kind of in how they've navigated the world of school, of work, of family, of college. And it's a very kind of hearts and minds film about inclusive education. So that came out about 10 years ago. And then I started thinking, maybe it's the best case I can make for inclusion is much more broad than Samuel. Maybe just focusing on Samuel isn't the best persuasive case I can make. Maybe there's a case to be made that inclusive education, having kids with disabilities in the classroom, actually benefits kids without disabilities as much or more than kids with disabilities. So I know you guys are data folks, a lot of you, so I'm going to give you some data. It may be hard to read this in the back, so I'll explain it. So there's a great researcher at Vanderbilt University. His name is Eric Carter. He's done a series of studies where he looked at both inclusive classrooms and environments and more segregated classrooms and environments. And what he did was he took the same material that kids were studying for, the same tests, kept all the variables constant, and he studied groups where there was a mixed group of abilities, kids with and without disabilities working together, learning together, studying together, preparing for exams together. And then he compared those against groups of just kids without disabilities, right? Just the typical kids. So one group was a hybrid group with and without disabilities. One was just kids without disabilities. And he did this again and again and again with multiple groups, many, many times. And he found that in those inclusive groups, in those mixed groups, the kids without disabilities were scoring an average of 15 points higher on the test that they were preparing for. 15 points higher. And never did he find that there was any drop in the typical kids in those inclusive environments. They only scored either the same or higher. And then he did the qualitative part of the research and interviewed kids, like, why, how is this happening? Tell me about your experience. And they would say things like, well, I was working with Johnny and we were trying to figure out the material together and I was kind of explaining to him in different ways and we were talking about it and we were trying to figure it out together and I didn't want him to fail the test. I didn't want to fail the test, so we were really trying to figure it out. So basically what happened was the kids in those mixed environments were more engaged in the curriculum. They were teaching and reteaching the material. They were explaining it in all different ways. They were trying to come at it from different access points. When all those things happen, you learn the material more thoroughly. Then you're going to do better on the tests. So that's what he found, and that's what I'm finding in studies around the country, is that inclusive environments never seem to have negative impacts on kids without disabilities academically. They only have positive or zero impact. So that's part of the case I might make. But the other part is beyond academics. So I'll ask you guys a quick question. I'll do a quick survey of the room. When you think of who you are today as a full person, not just the reason you're here professionally, but like the movies you stream on Netflix, the people you hang out with, the books you choose to watch or read, the hobbies you have, what had a bigger impact on you in terms of who you are as a full person? Was it the academic experience of school or the social and emotional experience of school? Let's think about K through 12 school. So how many of you would say, and there's no wrong answer, I promise, but how many of you would say the academic experience of school had a bigger impact, K through 12, on who you are as a person today? It's really okay. I would get some people who say yes. Really? All right. All right. How many of you would say the social and emotional had a bigger impact on who you are today? So, and this is a pretty, a lot of you do very technical jobs and very, jobs that require a lot of academic background, but still you're saying that the social and emotional had a bigger impact on you. And I would say that when you grow up in a diverse environment, whether it's ethnically, racially, gender, sexual orientation, disability, you have a more interesting and rich and at times challenging, in a good way, experience. You are challenged to develop more socially and emotionally, including, I would say, and I'll get to this more later, when you're alongside students with emotional and behavioral disabilities and mental health issues. So, but how do we judge schools? Do we judge them by how well they do by the social and emotional development on kids? Not primarily. If you know anything about educational assessments at the state level and the federal, it's all test scores. It's all test scores and how kids are doing on tests, even though you just proved to me, I think, that there's also another component that schools should take a responsibility for. So this is a lesson that I love to tell, a story that illustrates it perfectly for me. So Samuel, you saw Jacob in his high school graduation picture. Jacob's been a lifelong friend there, riding on the back of Samuel's wheelchair, and his friend Fletcher. And we went to Cooperstown, New York a few years ago. Anybody been to Cooperstown? Baseball Hall of Fame, a few people. It's really cool. I mean, we hung out there, lingered at the Red Sox display of all those championship rings from the last 15 years. And just the Hall of Fame itself was great. It was beautifully designed, very accessible for a wheelchair. And then we went out for lunch in downtown Cooperstown. Does anybody notice something that might have been a barrier for us in getting into a restaurant? What? What do you see? Right, steps. And I don't mean like 3 steps, 4 steps. There are steps like this, like 3, 4, 5 inches in front of almost every store. But if any of you have been with somebody or you tried using a power wheelchair, that is like the Berlin Wall. I mean, you are not getting over a 4-foot step, a 4-inch step in a power wheelchair. So it took us 40 minutes to find a place to have lunch in Cooperstown. And you know, for Samuel, unfortunately, this is a little bit of old hat. Like, we're always dealing with accessibility. For Fletcher and Jacob, they couldn't believe it. They'd never experienced anything like this, just to get into a restaurant. So they were pretty annoyed, and when we got back a couple weeks later, the same 2 kids were over our house watching a Patriots game, and they said, you know, we should write a letter to Cooperstown and tell them about our experience and complain. I was like, go for it. Sounds great. I'll type, you dictate. So I got on my computer, and they started writing things like this. They said, we are very mad because almost all of the stores in downtown Cooperstown are not accessible to someone in a wheelchair. We had $100 to spend, and we had a rule. If Samuel couldn't get into the store, then none of us would buy anything from it. We hope that this letter will change downtown Cooperstown before anyone else has to struggle with what we did. And then they sent this to the Chamber of Commerce and all the newspapers that covered Cooperstown. And about 2 weeks later, I get a call from a woman at the Chamber of Commerce, and she says, oh, Mr. Habib, so happy your son and his friends took the time to write their letter. You know, we're really appreciative. Can you give us any suggestions as to how to make downtown Cooperstown more accessible to someone in a wheelchair? Of course, I'm thinking, like, ramps? Ever heard of ramps? Not that uncommon. Pretty common. But yeah, I didn't say that, but I'm thinking, anyway. And then I'm thinking, well, I didn't say this either, but like, don't you have any people in your own community that have disabilities, that are engineers, that are architects, that are urban planners? I didn't say that. I just said something about, well, you know, didn't look that hard to make the downtown accessible. I'm sure it wouldn't be that much work. Anyway, she was thankful and da-da-da. About 2 years after that, one of my friends who has family in Cooperstown visited them and came back and knew about this story and said, Dan, you're not going to believe it. They've totally overhauled downtown Cooperstown and made it accessible. All the stores are now accessible. And I was, of course, thinking, oh, Samuel and his friends, they did all this. This is great. I mean, realistically, they probably had a plan, like a long-term plan for the community. It was probably something they were going to do. Maybe the letters nudged it along a little bit, put a little extra pressure. But I think the greater lesson and point I draw from this is think of the lesson that Fletcher and Jacob learned about human rights, about civil rights, about standing up for a friend, about, you know, access for all to important parts of our society. That's the kind of lesson that is profound and that is going to stay with them their whole life, and that they never would have learned if they hadn't had Samuel as a classmate and a friend. You know, they never would have learned that lesson. And I can't think of a greater lesson in our society than that. And then to take action and to see results. And Fletcher's mom, who's a 5th grade teacher, used that in her class to teach other students about standing up, about civil rights, about activism, about advocacy. So some of this is about Samuel, some of this is about his friends and kids without disabilities, but I also think it's about looking even farther down the line at our nieces and nephews who are very young right now, or our grandchildren who are young or not even born yet, or you know, sons and daughters, and thinking about the kind of world we want them to live in. Really, that is what this all comes down to for me. You know, what kind of world do we want them to live in? Do we want them to live in a world where disability is seen as something that needs to be segregated and ostracized, and there's this stigma around disability, whether it's a mental health disability or a physical disability or autism? Or do we want them to see disability as a normal part of our world? And you know, I can't honestly do anything here today that makes as persuasive a case as the experience of being alongside and living alongside people with disabilities. I mean, that is what it really takes to feel this way, I think, that disability is a normal part of our world. You have to be immersed in an inclusive environment, which is the same for any diversity that we talk about. You have to actually live it and experience it. So I'm going to shift in a minute to showing you a couple of short video clips from some of my work that I think is really going to be relevant to what you do. But I want to just close this part with a story about Samuel's teacher. I mentioned Barbara O'Brien, who taught his K-1-2 multi-age classroom when he was young. And she was, as I said, just such a beautiful teacher. And she was the kind of teacher that always said, You got a tough kid, you got a kid that you don't think you know how to include, behavior issues, language issues, bring it on. Like, I'll figure it out. I want to reach every kid. So we've had a lot of refugee resettlement in central New Hampshire. So people, first it was the former Yugoslavia when the war happened there. Then it became Iran, Iraq, now more and more African countries, Nepalese, all over the world. We've had resettlement throughout central New Hampshire. And Concord has had hundreds, even thousands of new Americans come. So that's been a wonderful thing for our community in terms of diversity, but a little challenging for the schools in terms of having all these English language learners, come to the schools at once, all these kids that have no understanding of the American culture and language. So Barbara had this student that came in, who was about 5 or 6 years old, from Burundi, from Africa, who had been living in a Kenyan refugee camp for years, and literally in a tent, until their whole life, basically, for 3-4 years. And so they're plopped down into Concord, New Hampshire, and asked to suddenly immerse themselves in a regular classroom and learn English and learn the American culture and language. And that's tough. And so Barbara O'Brien relayed to me that this little girl was completely embraced by the class, that the classmate, Samuel, who had been with Samuel for 2 years at this point, that the class was so flexible and kind of communicative and creative in the way they used body language and to help her learn how to navigate the cafeteria and the classroom. They found ways to use gestures, and they found ways to teach her basic words. And she said they showed such leadership and creativity and innovation and communication. And she said that's what they've learned from Samuel. Those are the skills they've learned from Samuel the last couple years. And think about, many of you employ people, right? Many of you hire people. Are you looking for the kid or the young adult who scored a B+ in algebra? Or are you looking for somebody that shows leadership, communication, innovation, collaboration, creativity? I'm going to guess those are the kind of skills you're looking for more than anything when you look to hire people. And those are the kind of skills you develop in diverse environments. So when I finished including Samuel, I started showing it around the country. And a question that came up again and again and again was, sure, you've shown how Samuel with a physical disability can be included, but what about kids with emotional and behavioral disabilities? So I think this is a lot of the world that you guys work in, which is kids, young adults, kids who have, emotional behavioral disabilities, whether it's schizophrenia, bipolar, post-traumatic stress, fetal alcohol syndrome, anxiety, depression, right? I mean, I could go on and on, but all the things that are part of your world. Kids who have those type of disorders and diagnoses are only included in regular education 35% of the time in this country. And when we talk about inclusion, that means the federal standard for inclusion means you spend 80% of your day in general education settings. Only 35% of kids with those disorders are included in regular education by that standard. And fewer than 50% will graduate from high school. So those are awful stats when you think about, in terms of the graduation rate, it's up around 85% for typical students, 50% for students with emotional behavioral disabilities. So that was the time when I decided, maybe I could do a second film specifically around students with emotional behavioral disabilities. So I started a project that kind of would show what works, and it's called Who Cares About Kelsey? I'm going to show you a clip from that, but before I do, I'll just tell you two things that I was finding. When I talked to a lot of experts around the country, the things that they said are really effective, two of the things in helping students with emotional behavioral disabilities be successful. One is positive behavioral supports. Have you guys heard of that? It's the basic idea, the way I would describe it, is rather than punitive measures, expelling kids, suspending kids, it's saying, let's understand behavior as communication. Let's try and figure out what's causing the challenging behavior. Let's try and give that student positive supports that help them see a different way of behaving. Let's try and really incentivize positive behavior. Let's teach them positive behavior. And let's give them a sense that there's something at the end of the road positive for them if they can get through this challenging time. And a lot of it also has to do with person-centered planning, which is another approach where you have a student who assembles a group of people that they really trust, and in that safe environment can think about what they want to do, what their dreams are, their goals are, their hopes. And then that group of people helps them brainstorm ways to achieve those goals. And this happened for a student named Kelsey, both of those things, over the course of years. So I'm going to dim the lights just here up front for a minute. Thank you for that. And we're going to show you just a 5-minute trailer from the film Who Cares About Kelsey? Okay.
Freshman year I came here. They didn't really know my situation.
I got suspended for the intent of selling and possession of a controlled substance. And they were gonna report me to the police, but they didn't because it was my own prescription.
No one really helped me. Kind of didn't really care. Sophomore year wasn't good. Second sophomore year wasn't good. School was full of drugs. There wasn't a day where someone didn't get in a fight or you didn't hear about someone doing drugs in the bathroom. So it was an everyday occurrence.
We can have lots of dreams and hopes for you, but you are the one that plays a critical role. What your vision, what your passion is, will determine whether or not you achieve those dreams.
Cheerleaders are supposed to be like preppy and nice and perfect and popular. I'm like mean and evil. Let any one of these little kids say something and I'm gonna hit them.
I overthink about things. I have one verse of a song in my head and I'll sing it over and over again because I can't stop thinking about it.
I don't like taking my medicine.
It makes me not want to eat, not want to sleep. When you have ADHD, you suppress a lot of things, like thoughts and anger and energy, and then one day, like, I am f***ing pissed off.
I've been working my ass off all freaking week just to fail now.
It's just a pain in the ass. I just get frustrated with it.
Kelsey has an emotional behavioral disability. The characteristics are someone who's withdrawn, who's impulsive,
Shut up.
who's depressed and anxious and has low self-worth. And those are all the characteristics that Kelsey demonstrates.
When you have like a shitty past, you personally like block it out so that you don't remember all the hard times.
When we lived in Georgia, like, we would have to get up, get dressed. My sister used to like wash us in the sink and like put like baby powder and stuff all over us. My mom was always drunk or high or whatever.
I hate myself for my kids suffering, and I know it's affected Kelsey, and it's probably hurt her way of thinking. I don't like that. I don't like it at all.
When she was younger, I was constantly working. So there was a good chunk of my kids' lives where I wasn't around to follow through with what they were doing.
Kelsey, you're coming right down to the wire. I'm just saying that the tolerance level for misbehavior right now is very low. You got it?
Yep.
We want you to graduate.
If you dwell like on the bad things that like started really bad, like when I was growing up, you tend to get like think about it a lot. You get depressed. So like, what's the point in thinking about it? I just block it out completely.
By not asking for help, Kelsey, you're setting up your own roadblock. You're always going to need to find someone you can trust, and that's something that you just have to internally accept, you know? You're a very determined person, and you feel like, I've always taken care of me, I don't need anybody in my life to help me. There's going to be a time in your life, and this is right now, you might need more than just yourself to get through this. And there's no shame and there's no embarrassment in that. You know what I mean?
One day they told me to go to this meeting. I didn't know what it was for, but I went anyway because I wouldn't have to be in class, so it was kind of cool.
All right, so Kelsey, what's the agenda for today?
Graduating, why not?
Graduating.
If I don't graduate, I'm pretty sure I'm not coming to this school.
How many classes is she passing right now?
2 of her classes right now.
Out of 4?
Out of 4.
Okay.
Which is
so
opposite
that's going to
and-
put her way off track for graduation.
Right.
28 days until I graduate, kind of. It's crunch time.
The reality is Kelsey has stopped taking her meds. She feels it really changes her personality, and she doesn't like how it makes her feel. She wants to try to manage this ADHD on her own.
Take the magazine, put it in. Right now it's on safe.
Police work is obviously what I want to do.
If you want to do criminal justice, that's fine, but like I've been saying, I've seen a department turn down a female that was your size because I think that they think she wouldn't have been able to handle herself.
Kind of hoping that won't be the case. I always thought his perception on me was that you can't do anything, you won't go on to anything. I want to prove my father wrong. B1 plus B2. I don't know how to do that. Get over here! Now! I need help!
You want to help her make it? What are you having trouble on?
Nothing, just being stupid. 32 plus 36 plus 35.
Awesome, great job.
You know, Tuesdays we've been doing check-ins. You staying on track.
And then 20 divided by 4?
Your goals are being met.
Yep, exactly.
And then when I met with you on Thursday, I said, what's going on in that? And you said you did something that you really don't typically do.
I asked for help.
Stare out a cold window. Close your eyes as the shadows grow. Maybe they'll leave you alone, but that's not how this story goes. Meet in a snowy field. Lower my sword as shield. Your wounds, they will never heal, and there's nothing left for you to steal. Then you'll understand. Baby, then you'll understand.
Thank you. Bring the lights back up. Thank you. Thank you. I want to talk to you a little bit about Kelsey, and then I'm going to show you a couple things. But so Kelsey is, first of all, Kelsey, there was pretty general consensus within her educational community and a lot of people that knew her that she was on a really bad path at 14, 15 years old, as you saw in the film. She was probably going to end up incarcerated or at least involved with the juvenile justice system, like much of her family and friends. Most of her family and friends had become pregnant before the age of 18. A lot of them were getting into drugs and alcohol. You know, this is 6 minutes from an hour-long film, and she talks very openly in the film about being sexually abused as a kid and what that, and then her parents not really doing anything about it, even though they kind of knew because her mom was really involved in drugs at the time. It's a really tangled story. But because of what happened in the high school, and the positive support she got and the very intentional structure she got to help her get through high school, she's 27. Yesterday she turned 27. I was just texting with her. She has a beautiful 4-year-old daughter who's not a 10-year-old daughter, if you know what I mean. It's a 4-year-old daughter. She has a full-time job at a bank as a bank teller, and she's got a really great, stable life. I mean, it's not without drama. It's not without, stuff, but she's doing really well. And I think that I credit that to this very intentional kind of support structure she had in high school. So just real quickly, there's something that I wanted to point your attention to. In addition to the film, which you can learn more about on whocaresaboutKelsey.com and see how to watch the whole film, we have a multimedia section that is free, has a whole bunch of free films you can watch that I think you'll be interested in. It has the trailer you just saw. It also has a film called Marcel, who's a boy in St. Louis with very complicated mental health issues, very prone to violence, and how the school is trying to help him be supported and included in his school. So you can watch that, about a 17 or 18-minute film. The school's also doing a lot of work around racial disparities in discipline, the fact that black boys are disciplined at a much higher rate than white boys and how they're trying to address that. There's films on young kids with autism, like Taja, who's also an English language learner, and how they've been very successful in helping her be supported and included. And then I know you guys do a lot of work around juvenile justice work and incarceration, and there's 6 interviews I did with young adults who are incarcerated and talking to them about what happened in elementary school, middle school, that changed their life. What got them on this path towards incarceration, and what could have made a difference to get them on a different path. And they're very powerful stories. I'd recommend this one, Tariq, is a great starter. It's a 10-minute, each of these are about 10 minutes long. And he talks so eloquently about his substance abuse in middle school and how nobody noticed because he wasn't a troublemaker. He was sleeping in class, but he wasn't violent, and nobody noticed, and his alcoholism got worse and worse, and then he started getting arrested, multiple times a month in middle school because of alcohol possession, and he ended up getting into worse drugs and getting arrested as an adult. He's still incarcerated. And then there's a couple other films, one on restraint and seclusion that I did around the impact of students being physically restrained and secluded. So anyway, there's a lot on the Who Cares About Kelsey site. I'm going to show you one more clip from my latest film, and then I'm going to open it up for the last 10 minutes just for any questions you have, and I hope you have something you want to ask or share. So I started showing Who Cares About Kelsey around the country. It was broadcast nationally, including Samuel, both on PBS. This one was 2013. And then I decided that there was another story to tell, and that is around students with intellectual disability. And the fact that, I talked to you earlier about the stats around students with emotional behavioral disability and the high rates of segregation. Well, the most segregated group in this country are people with intellectual disabilities. And I could make a pretty persuasive case, I think, just by giving you a few quick stats. Only 17% of students with intellectual disability are included in regular education. Only 17%. Only 35 to 40%, depending on the study you look at, will graduate with a regular diploma. And the employment rate nationally, currently, for people with adults with intellectual disability is 15%. And that doesn't include sheltered workshop work, which you're probably familiar with, where people with disabilities are just segregated, often making sub-minimum wage in kind of segregated environments, because that's not seen as real employment by the federal government. So anyway, I thought, well, maybe there's another story to tell specifically around intellectual disability. And as Samuel has gotten older and is in these transition years now of doing college and all these cool things, I've been getting more interested in that age in adults as well, and doing films around transition age young adults. So about probably 6 years ago, the Dean of Education at Syracuse University, who has been a great mentor to me on some of my films, said, Dan, if you could just challenge the way people perceive intelligence, and challenge people to see intelligence more broadly. Not something that can be measured by an IQ test or an SAT score, but that people can show intelligence in all different ways. And if you could just like blow up the whole notion that there's any one way to measure intelligence, that would be a great thing for the field, for you to do. And then he walked away and was like, all right, go make a film. But anyway, I started thinking, oh, how do you do that? And so part of it was thinking about the history of intelligence testing. And how many of you are familiar with the eugenics movement? Just raise your hand if that rings a bell. So a bunch of you, but not all of you. So eugenics was happening in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, really even into later. And it basically labeled people with intellectual disabilities, which used to be called mental retardation or other names like feeble-minded, morons, idiots. Those were actually clinical names for people with intellectual disabilities in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Anyway, the eugenics basically said these people are dangerous, they need to be segregated, they need to be institutionalized. So hundreds of thousands of people with intellectual and other disabilities were institutionalized in this country. So hopefully many of you know that, and there's still institutions that exist, but they're slowly being dismantled. But perhaps even worse, 60,000 people in this country were forcibly sterilized because they had an intellectual disability. And in 1927, the US Supreme Court affirmed the rights of states to do forcible sterilization based on disability. And so we have this really sordid history in this country that a lot of people aren't aware of, that much of it's stemming from IQ testing. And then it carries into the present day. 49 out of 50 states are still using IQ testing as one of the key tools to determine a student's disability, and which often yields two things. One is it often means they're going to be in a segregated environment, and it also means they're going to have this number attached to them, which what does it really represent in terms of their capacity to be part of the world? And just a real-time example, my sister-in-law teaches school in Florida. And she's a coach now. She's like a master teacher, and she coaches in multiple buildings. And she was going from one school to another recently, and in one school, kids with disabilities were included alongside their peers. The other school, they were totally segregated. It was actually, I think, a whole segregated school. And she said, well, what's the difference between the two groups of kids? And the principal said, oh, the students that are included have 56 or above on their IQ. The students that are segregated have 55 or below. So imagine just 1 or 2 points will determine their whole trajectory for education. So anyway, I thought, well, maybe I can tell a little bit of the history, but maybe I can also show what would a whole new way of seeing intelligence look like. Who are the paradigm shifters? Who are the people that can show a different way of expressing themselves and their intelligence? And I was fortunate to find 3 young adults, Micah, Nair, and Naomi. So the film that I'm now releasing nationally was just in Los Angeles, and then New York City, and then Washington. I'm heading to Rochester, New York tomorrow, and I'm actually traveling just about every week this year showing this film, Intelligent Lives, around the country. So, so probably almost any state that you're in, we're showing the film in your state, and we have a screening list under the See the Film button, so you can check that out. But I just want to show you a 2-minute trailer from Intelligent Lives, then we'll just open it up for a little bit of Q&A.
Our son, Jesse, had cerebral palsy. When Jesse was 4, the neurologist told us that he would never be intellectually normal. We fought to have Jesse included in general education.
The IQ test measures a very limited potential of our brain to learn and misses all the other stuff.
Naomi, Micah, and Nair, 3 young adults with disabilities, unlocking their potential.
You happy with your tip you made?
Yeah. You know what you're gonna buy with this?
Cell phone.
I'm getting a 9-degree certificate in disability studies.
Nair is not afraid to greatly express himself.
Do you want to go to college?
Yeah.
When people say, why is your school successful? Because we include students with significant disabilities.
We don't use IQ tests to inform us at all.
Not long ago, IQ testing was used to fuel a pseudoscience known as eugenics, which called for eliminating the menace of the feeble-minded. Institutions like Willowbrook more closely resembled prisons than schools.
We have to broaden our understanding of what intelligence is. I want my son to go into a world where he's looked at not there as a tall black guy who's acting weird.
Whether it's a police officer or a civilian, you do wonder what's going to happen.
I think because of Naomi's unconditional love for what she does, it's good for everyone.
Are you on Facebook?
No.
Okay.
My parents don't think that's safe.
What do you remember most about today?
Be ourselves.
Be ourselves.
Can any attempt to measure intelligence predict a person's value or ability to contribute meaningfully to the world?
You can bring the lights back up, please. So as I mentioned, that film is now all around the country, and if you're interested, you can in seeing it, you can go to either the screenings page on our website, or we have a pretty cool system set up for this film where you can host a screening anywhere around the country. And we just had like 7 or 8 last night all over the country, and we work with a group called Gather, which has relationships with AMC and Lowe's and independent theaters all over the country. And you go through our website, and in like 5 minutes and 5 clicks, you can host a screening at a local theater in your community. It doesn't cost you anything. You just have to get the word out in your community or within your workplace to get a certain number of people to buy tickets, like 30 or 40 tickets usually, just regular movie tickets, and then the screening tips, and it happens. It doesn't cost you a dime, and we coach you through the whole process. We support you and tell you exactly how you can get the screening to happen in your community. So if you want to do that, if you're interested, we'll help you make sure it happens. We also have an education kit if you want to show it more like as a professional development or workplace. That's also on the website. So I'm going to Rochester, New York tomorrow with Micah. We're co-presenting, and Micah is a great paradigm shifter. He is, as you saw briefly in the film, he's co-teaching classes at Syracuse University. He just got a certificate in disability studies. He's got this great circle of friends, doctoral students, graduate students. He's very active on social media. He was given an IQ of 40 when he was a kid, 40. So, I mean, what a paradigm shifter. So, all right, I've thrown a lot at you, and I'm promising to get you out at 10 o'clock sharp for your break. But if I did anything this morning, I hope I said something that was provocative or that got you thinking or that made you want to ask something or share something. So I just appreciate a few questions, comments about anything. So just raise your hand. We do have a mic that would probably be good to use if we can. But I know you probably all have to use the bathroom, want to get another cup of coffee. But if you could just indulge me in just 1 or 2 questions, something, or else I have no idea what you're thinking. Go ahead. Sure. So what types of communities are more or less inclined to do inclusion, do it well? You know, that's a great question. And I can speak more anecdotally, although I think it's backed up by research. There is not necessarily any correlation in terms of socioeconomics, geography, or kind of other demographics, other than certain states where the State Department of Education has made it a very high priority to do inclusion. Those states have much higher rates of inclusion. So New Hampshire, Vermont, North Dakota, a few other states have like 70, 80% of kids with disabilities being included. Virginia, Washington, D.C., you know, there's random states are down like 10%, 10, 15%. So I do see a lot of state-by-state, you know, variation. Although I would say that from my own experience, and I talk about socioeconomics, you know, I've been in certain very wealthy communities, you know, suburbs of New York or D.C. presenting, and I'll hear things like, oh, we just don't have the money to do inclusion. And then I went to Sunflower, Mississippi, which is on the Mississippi Delta. If you know anything about that area, it's a very poor area of the country, like 100% free and reduced lunch population. The family median income was $19,000 a year, and they were doing inclusion so beautifully well. And it was about leadership at the school district level. Superintendents and principals who both believed in this and just had a philosophy that I've kind of shared around inclusion, but also were then willing to do the professional development and training for their staffs to teach them how to differentiate their instruction for different kinds of learners. Create universally designed school classrooms where information is being presented auditorially, visually, experientially, through text, you know, because I think that's the key, is giving kids lots of multiple access points to learn the material. They do a lot of collaborative instruction where students are encouraged to work together, and in station-based teaching where they're moving from one place to another, not like lecture-based classroom teaching. And this was Sunflower, Mississippi. So whenever I go to a district that's really wealthy and say, we just don't have the money to do this, I just talk about Sunflower, Mississippi. Like, if they can do it there, believe me, you can do it here in the suburbs of New York. Nothing against New York. I love New York, but, you know, there's not an excuse. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that about your own family story and your efforts to have her daughter, you said, right, included. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think I hear stories all around the country. I hear stories, maybe you experienced something like this, where parents of kids at the kindergarten age are being told that their child can't be successful in kindergarten. I'm like, what is more universally designed than kindergarten, right? In terms of access, all different kinds of experiential access and learning. So, you know, my work, and I really appreciate you sharing that and that you stuck with it, and it sounds like it's had a positive trajectory. You know, I hear from a lot of parents when I do a lot of talks for parents, and every parent loves their child. Every parent's trying to do the best they can, and so the families you work with who decide to maybe have their kid in a separate placement, there's probably a reason for that. But I really work to put pressure on school districts and states to do everything they can to help students be successful before they consider alternative placements, because it disconnects you from your community. There's no doubt. And for some kids, you're also being surrounded by other kids who have emotional behavioral challenges or other disabilities, trauma, you know, and that's not necessarily going to be the best environment when you're surrounded by kids who are also exhibiting a lot of the same challenging behavior. You don't have the chance for the same modeling and learning. So anyway, I think it's really important to separate a family's own journey, which are, you know, like yours, and the systems work. That is so important that you're all doing to try and support more inclusive systems and structures. Yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead. Yeah.
That's something that didn't cost them a lot of money. They just use a textbook that is also available online, and everyone gets to keep up.
That's great. That's a really great anecdote. And so a couple things to add on to that. Like, I know Harvard now, and I'm sure many other colleges, don't allow any book to be taught unless it's available as an audiobook. You cannot use that as a textbook unless it's available auditorially. Also, just technology has been a real game changer for my own family, many families. You know, not only does Sam have the communication device and a really cool wheelchair, but he's been having access to an iPad since he was probably in middle school. And there were times where students were doing independent reading, he would just pop up, you know, the audiobook. Or they might be doing a reading of like some dense scientific text, and he'll watch a brain pop video around the same science, but in a much more universal way. Now he's using a Chromebook, and that's been a real game changer to have Google Classroom. I don't know if you're familiar with that platform. But in Google Classroom, teachers can assign the work and modify it slightly for different students. So when he's home in the afternoon working on his homework, the teacher's already assigned the work, but she might say, all right, Sam, well, I'm having most of the class try and, you know, learn 40 or however many elements there are on the periodic table. I haven't done chemistry for a while. But we really, these are the 12 that you really need to understand. So I want you to master these 12. So she's able to modify the homework on the fly fairly easily, and we see what's happening in real time at home through Google Classroom. It's been amazing. You had your hand up. Sir, a gentleman right there. Yeah. Yeah.
More frequent depictions of disabilities on television shows.
Yeah.
And just the trend seems to be that it's just more regular now. Do you have any thoughts on some of those that are more accurate, or that you would maybe recommend? I like this show Speechless.
Yeah, I like that as well.
I don't know if it's a healthy depiction or not, but we enjoy it.
Yeah, great point. So about depictions in media of disability, I agree that it's improving for sure. Nothing is ever as fast as I want it to be, but it's improving. I watch Speechless with Samuel, and we love it. We watch that together. It's about a show about a boy in a family who uses a communication device, and he's kind of the center of the story. I do think there's been improvement in that area. I've done some work with the Ford Foundation. They're doing some work right now around depictions of disability in media, and one of the biggest concerns is that they're not having actors and actresses with disability play those parts. And there's a really strong push to have more and more of the actors play the roles of people with disabilities, because there are plenty of people who want to act who have autism or have physical disabilities or other mental health issues. So I do see positive change, but I think that's an area where we can do much better. And again, I think change doesn't just happen from any one way. People think, oh, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, didn't that fix everything? You know, of course it didn't. There's still so much stigma and so many misconceptions around disability that I think the media, law, you know, having discussions like this at a conference, that continues to move the needle. Yeah, gentleman right there. Yeah. Oh, I thought you had your hand up. Okay. That's a great point. I think a lot of the educational innovations that happen because of disability in the disability world are now benefiting, just checking the time for you guys, are now benefiting, you know, a wider swath. So I promise to get you out of here at 10, and I'm going to linger for a little bit, and I'm happy to talk to people individually, but I really enjoyed being with you, and I hope you enjoyed this morning, and have a great conference the rest of the day. Thank you.